Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Geyn. Today we're discussing Bill C-34, the Social Media Safety Act. The government says that this proposed legislation is about protecting children online, removing child sexual abuse material, combating terrorism, and making social media and artificial intelligence safer for kids. The bill would also ban anyone under 16 from using social media. But also included in the bill is what some critics call a sneak attack on Canadians' privacy online. C-34 would create a powerful new digital safety commission, regulate AI chatbots, require social media companies to mitigate vaguely defined harmful content, and leave dozens of critical policy decisions to regulators and cabinet rather than Parliament itself. Supporters call it online safety, but critics call it a sweeping internet regulation bill. Joining me today are two guests to talk about different aspects of the bill. We're joined first by John Shell of Unplugged Canada. John, thank you so much for joining me today. Let's start by talking about the problem here. Why has social media become such a concern for parents? What changes have you seen in kids over the last decade from the perspective of your organization?
Yeah, and look, I'm not going to break any new ground here. This conversation has been had a lot in the media. I think there are three core arguments. First, being that many studies show that there's real harm from social media use, with examples as extreme as suicide and exploitation for sex. It's known to be addictive and harmful to attention and focus. And third, the companies themselves are awful, and they build products designed to addict our kids. They've been proven over time to do this intentionally and often smugly, and there's no evidence that we can trust them. So some action is necessary. You asked whether I've seen changes to kids. Like my kid was 3 10 years ago, so I can't talk about, and she doesn't have social media, so I can't at 13, so I can't speak to changes for her. But I haven't spoken to a single parent over the last 15 years who didn't think social media was awful for their kids. Not a single one. And at some point, that has to matter.
So, Australia has already introduced legislation to ban under 16s from social media, and it's already been enforced. What have we learned from the experience in Australia about whether or not the ban is working there?
I mean, first we have to talk about what Australia actually did. So they first set up a regulator, right? The one that you talked about in the opening. There are a number of bills moving through that legislature, some that have passed and some that will pass, all about more root cause issues of online harms. And the third are age restrictions for kids on social media. So it's a comprehensive package. It is often limited in discussion to a social media ban, but it's not that. It's much more comprehensive. And it's too soon to know how it's going to work, right? There are some very early results, but their whole plan in Australia was iterative. We're going to do this, we're going to see how it goes, and then we're going to change things as we go. And that's what they're doing. The amazing thing about what happened in Australia is the entire world has looked at what Australia has done, and almost everyone has said, we want to do that too. I mean, the number of countries that are following Australia's lead on this is remarkable. And in fact, there's almost no parallel. Like you go back to like seatbelts or maybe banning indoor smoking are the only similar areas where so many countries were doing the same thing at the same time. And even then, it wasn't. And it's wildly popular. It remains incredibly popular in Australia 6 months after it was implemented.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually noteworthy how many countries have come out in the last, since the beginning of the year to announce
Yeah.
bans on social media, including, I think, the European Union announced a plan just this past week. But one of
Yes.
the things that I think I want to talk about for C-34 is that a lot of the details of age verification are not included in the legislation. So it's one thing to say we're banning under 16, but how do you actually enforce that? Does it concern you at all that the decision, we don't know what it's going to look like right now?
Look, I think the general plan in other countries is to leave it to a regulator. It allows them to adapt to what's happening elsewhere. We're having an extraordinary opportunity now to learn the right way to do age restrictions. We're learning from Australia. Europe has a new tool that they are piloting around age verification that won't require providing ID to anyone. There's no country that I know where the reflex is you have to provide ID in order to get on social media. So, I think that having it in a regulator that's able to move quickly based on evidence that we're learning the rest of the world. We have it's an extraordinary petri dish to learn will work.
We've got to go to break, but we'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing Bill C-34 and the under 16 social media ban with John Schell from Unplugged Canada. John, look, I know a lot of parents watching this probably agree that social media isn't healthy for their children. I have 3 kids. I feel that way. I have concerns about my own social media use and trying to control it. But does that automatically mean that the government should ban it? I mean, what role is there for parenting versus expecting the government to solve what a lot of people might see as a private matter for their own family?
Look, we make decisions like this all the time as a country, right? We've done it with drinking, we've done it with gambling, we've done it with smoking, we've even done it with bike helmets, right? I mean, Toronto banned a bike or required bike helmets, and then Ontario said, no, you don't have to wear them anymore, except if you're under 18. So this is a common way that we manage harms like this in the country. There are all sorts of evidence over the years where the corporate interests will try to turn this into an individual responsibility problem. Never works, right? There are no examples of collective individual responsibility solving a problem like this. So this is just the common way that we do these things. So it's not at all surprising that after years of complete no regulation for these companies that have been proven to be so harmful, that finally we're starting to regulate them a little bit.
So a lot of these companies already have restrictions. Like a lot of them already say you aren't supposed to have an account unless you're above, whatever age it is, some age. But in a lot of situations, children lie about their age. They might borrow an account. They might get around an age restriction using a VPN. So if we're banning social media for under 16 when there already are these workarounds for the system we have now, are we actually solving the problem, or does this ban just kind of create a false sense of security that the government can say, look, we're solving your problem, parents, when really it won't actually address these workarounds?
Look, kids drink, kids smoke, kids do all the things that we don't allow them to do, but they do it a lot less than they would if there weren't age restrictions. I mean, this is about introducing friction and reducing the number of kids who are using it, right? Like, I'll give you an example. My daughter has a phone but doesn't have social media. All of her kids communicate through Snapchat, right? They don't want to be on Snapchat. This is what they've chosen to use as their means of communication. So my daughter is excluded from that, which is a shame. But if they couldn't get it, there's friction on Snapchat, then they would just use messages or they would use WhatsApp. It'd be a much more comfortable way for the kids to communicate. So it's the introduction of friction that's the critical thing.
One of the other things that critics of C-34 have said is that this bill, broadly speaking, could undermine the privacy of adults. For example, depending on how age verification is implemented. And some of the different proposals include the idea of uploading ID or having facial scans that use artificial intelligence to estimate ages. A lot of adults feel deeply uncomfortable with this type of requirement. So how do we get that balance between protecting kids online without requiring adults to give all this private information to a private company when they want to, scroll on X, for example?
Right. I mean, I think it's first important to understand that in all of these things, it's a one-time thing, right? You verify your age one time and you don't have to do it again. So there's people out there saying, every time I go on social media, I need to upload my ID. It's absolutely never going to be like that. There's not a country in the world who's trying to do it that way. Australia is experimenting with a mostly non-ID based approach, and obviously we know it's going okay. But the technology is changing, right? As you get like more or less half the GDP in the world is now trying to figure this thing out. That is a huge opportunity. Technology will improve, so this will be iterative. We'll figure out ways to do it that don't affect privacy. I understand people's concern. I think that's valid. It's still the minority. The majority are massively supportive of this thing. But it's something that will improve over time. And I think we should monitor it. I think we should, work towards age verification that doesn't require that type of information for those companies.
So, if you could give parents out there one piece of advice about raising kids in the digital world, what would it be?
I find that hard, right? Like we have it's a two-parent family. We're very lucky to be able to manage our kids' use the way we do. I know that that's not everyone's option. I honestly think getting behind this effort is what people should do. There is no practical, world. There's no world in where we can practically avoid social media for our kids without some form of government assistance, the way it is for a bunch of other things. So sign the pledge, talk to your mentees. That's what I will.
John, thanks so much for joining. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing Mark Carney's Bill C-34, the Social Media Safety Act. We're joined now by a lawyer with the Canadian Constitution Foundation, Josh Dehaas, who has some concerns. Josh, you've got some concerns about this legislation and how it could affect privacy. Let's get into the under 16 social media ban, because I think that is a topic so many parents are interested in. The bill would effectively, once regulations are passed, ban kids under 16 from social media. What are your concerns with that? Do you think it might actually work?
Well, in terms of the concerns, so I have big concerns about free speech and privacy, and we'll get into the free speech stuff later. But in terms of privacy, this is a ban for kids under 16. But in order to prove that somebody is over 16, it means every single one of us has to either show a piece of ID or have some other technology, somehow figure out our age. And that's a concern. I mean, this is the IDs are not going to government, so it's not government necessarily knowing that we're on social media. But I don't know if we can trust social media companies necessarily with that type of information. I mean, there was a big leak of Discord government IDs because Discord requires IDs. So there's privacy concerns there. And in
There's
terms of whether
also
it's effective or
just
not,
a question on this is, in the last segment, John from Unplugged, who supports the bill, said, you're not uploading your ID every time. You upload it once and then you're done. You don't need to show it every time you go on the internet. But isn't there a huge reason many people would want to remain anonymous online? And of course, there are nefarious reasons why you would want to be anonymous online, but there are also completely understandable reasons why you might want to be anonymous online. For example, if you're engaged in some type of activism where you're concerned with government retribution.
yeah, sure. So that's a big concern. I mean, just think of the Emergencies Act where the government froze certain bank accounts. That required knowing who you are. So sometimes you might want to keep your privacy before you protest. And it's an even bigger concern once we start getting to other countries that are much more authoritarian than Canada. And those countries will, potentially copy what we do here. And speaking of copying, this idea has been implemented in Australia since December 2025. And what we've seen in Australia is that 80%, according to one study, of 80% of kids between 12 and 15 were still on social media 6 months later because what they end up doing is using virtual private networks. So then the question becomes, well, if we're going to enforce this, are we going to start banning people from using VPNs? And VPNs are something that adults, including activists, use all the time to try to avoid detection and intrusion from governments. So basically, you start with this idea of, okay, we want to keep kids safe and we kind of want to keep them off social media, but you very, very quickly go down this slippery slope of government having more and more information about you that they really shouldn't have. And just one more point on this, effectiveness in Australia. If the goal is to keep kids safe, what they've seen is some kids are now going into either WhatsApp or Telegram, which are these very, very private groups where their parents have, no idea what they're talking about or who they're talking with. Whereas, social media like Facebook has parental controls built in. It allows parents to have some say and keep an eye on what their kids are doing. So maybe good intentions here, but lots of reasons for concerns.
Yeah, one of the other things we were discussing in the last segment is the idea of individual responsibility of parents versus the government's role. And there is a doctrine in Canadian law called mature minors. And I can see how some families might think, my 15-year-old is mature enough to have a TikTok account where they upload their sports highlights, for example. How does that doctrine intersect with this idea of banning all under 16-year-olds?
Yeah, well, kids have freedom of expression. The question is whether or not they're mature enough to have it under the law. And kids have, they're mature enough at age 14 to make medical decisions. So how can they not be mature enough at age 14 to express themselves on social media? And there are legitimate reasons kids should be on social media expressing themselves, whether it's to connect with other kids. Think of a gay kid in a small community, right? They need to connect with others, or they might have a business. I had a business when I was 16 years old, and you can bet I would be on social media if it had existed back then. So there are lots of reasons that kids might need to be on social media.
Or their parents might be okay with it. I do understand it's not right for every family, but every family is different. We've got to go to break now, but we'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing Bill C-34, the Social Media Safety Act. Now, Josh, we've been talking up until now about a big part of the bill that's attracted the most attention, which is the under 16 social media ban. But the bill actually does a lot more than that. One of the biggest changes is it proposes the creation of a new digital safety commission, a new bureaucratic entity. So maybe you can explain what that digital safety commission is, what it would do, and why Canadians should care.
Yeah, so the Digital Safety Commission is essentially a new speech police for Canada. And I know that sounds a little bit dramatic, but that really is what it is. It would be a bunch of bureaucrats in Ottawa, 3 to 5 commissioners supported by a big staff that are tasked with deciding whether or not social media companies as well as AI are meeting certain duties that would be created by this bill, the Digital Safety Act. And those duties are related to speech. So in addition to what they call the duty to protect children, which is to keep kids under 16 off social media, they would also enforce duties that apply to adults. So a duty to act responsibly, which means that they would be required to mitigate exposure to certain content, and this ranges from content that we can all agree should not be online and on social media, like content that sexually victimizes people or a terrorist content, but it also includes content that where there's a lot of gray area, like content that foments hatred. And we all like to think, well, who can support hate speech or hateful content online? But that's often in the eye of the beholder, whether or not something's hateful. And what we've seen with similar laws in Europe is that social media companies that are forced to mitigate this type of content on threat of huge fines, and this bill would have fines of up to tens of millions of dollars, they end up taking down a whole lot of speech that is just controversial, that's not actually over that line of hate speech. There's research that shows in Germany, like 99.7% of speech that gets taken down under a similar act there is actually fully lawful, and the numbers are about 90% or above in France, in Sweden as well. So the concern here is that you have the speech regulator in Ottawa, the Digital Safety Commission, that's threatening huge fines if social media companies and AI companies as well don't take down certain content, and that content is protected free speech.
Yeah, the AI stuff actually really surprised me about this bill. A lot of the stuff about fomenting hatred and using the Digital Safety Commission to create this duty to protect children from content that promotes hatred, that was in a previous Trudeau version of the bill. But this new version now applies to AI chatbots. And I kind of have this feeling that AI is going to be the next battleground for free expression. The idea that AI cannot provide answers to questions that might, in some really apprehensive way, the AI company might say, "I don't want to answer this question because the answer to the question, even if it's factual, could somehow be interpreted to foment hatred." Maybe you could expand on any of those points, the idea of
Yeah.
regulating chatbots and that chatbots might be the new frontier here for free speech battles.
You're absolutely right, Christine. I mean, chatbots like ChatGPT or Grok or any of them, that's where we go to get most of our information already. And all of that information is protected speech. It's speech that is created by humans and fed into the model and then, spit back out at us. And so the risk here is that if AI companies are going to face huge fines because of so-called harmful content and failure to mitigate that, we won't actually know whether we're getting the truth about things from the AI. And it's the same sort of issues that exist with social media, where there are things that, it's hard to decide whether or not they count as hateful. Whether we're talking about immigration or whether we're talking about gender identity or other, big controversies where we need to express ourselves in order to figure out how to deal with these from a policy perspective. The AI is just going to censor that to avoid these fines, and we won't even know that it's happening. So it's a really big concern.
Not just avoid fines, avoid the possibility of a fine, even on anything that's kind of in a gray area or in the edge. And if the government can't censor directly, they can't censor indirectly through these private companies. That's all the time we have, Josh. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We've heard today about Bill C-34, legislation that aims to protect children online, but also raises concerns about privacy, free expression, and government regulation of the internet. How should Canada balance online safety with individual freedom? You be the judge. Thanks for watching, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.